Hello, everybody. Welcome back to freepilotgroundschool.ca. We continue our lesson with the most boring subjects, general provisions, where we will talk about some definitions. You don't need to write these definitions down. I already wrote them all down for you in the handout provided on the website. So if you haven't downloaded that yet, I'd encourage you to download that and use that for your notes so you're not stuck writing all of this material down. However, I do still have to go through it, so bear with me as I work my way through this. So these definitions for some of the terms that you will find in the Canadian Aviation Regulations, or CARS for short, are all found in the first division of CARS, section 100. They're all in alphabetical order, and some of them relate to flight training, and some of them relate to aviation in general. So let's begin with aerobatic maneuver. As you can see in the definition, generally an abnormal pitch or attitude in acceleration. This would include a maneuver such as a spin, perhaps a spiral dive, definitely a roll where you're inverted, or a loop. It would not include something like a steep turn, though, at 45 degrees. If we talk about aerodrome traffic, that's pretty obvious. It's all the traffic that's both flying and on the ground that's in the vicinity of an aerodrome. And an aeroplane, this one comes up quite often, a power-driven, heavier-than-air aircraft that derives its lift in flight from aerodynamic reactions on surfaces that remain fixed in flight. So an aeroplane is what you're familiar with, let's say a Cessna 150, but it does not include a glider, and it does not include a balloon, and it does not include a helicopter. Airtime is the time that the aircraft takes off until the time that the aircraft lands. It is used for technical records, all times for an aircraft. If an aircraft has, let's say, 1,000 hours on the airframe, that's 1,000 hours of being in flight, being in the air. The next definition, air transport service, is a commercial air service that is operated for the purpose of transporting people or personal belongings. An airport is a certified aerodrome. So if you have a regular aerodrome, a place for taking off or landing, and you meet a bunch of additional requirements and you apply to Transport Canada for a certificate, you may be issued a certificate, and then your aerodrome becomes an airport. An airworthiness limitation is a limitation or maintenance task that's mandatory as a condition for the type certificate to be enforced. When we talk about a class of an aeroplane, it's a single defining characteristic of that airplane that is common to the class. So for example, single engine airplanes, multi-engine airplanes, land and sea, those are all different classes of airplanes. Our next definition, a commercial air service. I could probably lecture for about an hour on what a commercial air service is, because it comes up often in judicial decisions. So in this case, we talk about a commercial air service. It means that the use of an aircraft for hire or reward. And this is important because hire or reward is not just a direct cash payment. It can be any sort of monetary consideration. So let's just say I have an airplane and I have my pilot's license, and I want to fly from one city to another, and I take a friend of mine along, and my friend doesn't pay me anything. That's not considered a commercial air service. But let's say he pays me cash, or let's say he says, you know what, if you take me to the city, I will fix your deck for you. That's considered a monetary consideration, and that is considered a commercial air service. Our next definition, a controlled aerodrome. It's an aerodrome where air traffic control unit is in operation. So typically you will see a control tower. That's not always the case, but it's often the case that there will be a control tower at a controlled aerodrome. The definition of day is the time between the beginning of morning civil twilight and the end of evening civil twilight. Also, you can also say it's half an hour past sunset to half an hour, half an hour before sunrise until half an hour after sunset. Elementary work is maintenance work that is done, that is listed in the cars as elementary work in the aircraft equipment and maintenance standards. So this would be things like changing your oil, changing a tire, doing work on the upholstery in your airplane. This is the work that is allowed to be done by a pilot who is also the owner of their aircraft. They do not need an aircraft maintenance engineer to do that work. Fit for duty is the ability to act as a flight crew member and you're not impaired by fatigue, alcohol, drugs, or any mental or physical condition. Flight time is the time that the aircraft first moves under its own power for the purpose of taking off until the moment it comes to rest at the end of the flight. So remember, we talked about air time is the time that the aircraft is actually in the air. The flight time is when it's moving under its own power for the purposes of flying. It is flight time that you record in your personal pilot logbook, whereas you record air time in the aircraft's technical or journey logbooks. Flight training is a training program of ground instruction and flight training, of airborne training that is conducted in accordance with the flight instructor guide. Typically, flight training is conducted by flight instructors, but not always. So for example, a seaplane rating or a multi-engine rating or a large part of the instrument rating can be conducted by a commercial pilot that is qualified to do that kind of flying, but not necessarily a flight instructor. Whereas recreational pilot permit, commercial license, and private pilot all has to be conducted by a qualified flight instructor. Moving on from that definition, we now have a flight training service. So there's kind of a nuance in there. Flight training we just discussed. The flight training service is now a commercial air service. So as we discussed a few slides back, a commercial air service is when there is a monetary consideration. So somebody can offer flight training without having a flight training service. They just do it for free. Let's say you have a friend and you have an instructor rating, you can train them to fly as long as there's no money changing hands. However, once there's money changing hands, it is a commercial air service, and generally that requires an operating certificate, unless you're operating under one of the limited exemptions contained within the CARS, where you are allowed taking money for instructing without having a flight training unit operating certificate. Our next definition, flight visibility, is the visibility forward from the cockpit of an aircraft in flight. This obviously relates to weather, and it is different from the ground visibility that you might see on the ground. We have a couple maintenance definitions now. If you look through your journey logbook, you might see a maintenance release. In the maintenance release, you'll see some maintenance conducted, and then at the bottom, there'll be a statement, something like the maintenance described herein has been completed in accordance with the applicable maintenance standards, and then it is signed. Sometimes it's stamped, or a license number is there from an aircraft maintenance engineer. So if you see a journey logbook, take a look for that. And you need a maintenance release following any sort of maintenance on the aircraft. A maintenance schedule is required for every aircraft. Usually it's for private aircraft, it's in CAR 625 Appendix B and CAR 625 Appendix C. And for commercial operators, they have their own specialized maintenance schedule that is approved by Transport Canada, and it will specify when maintenance needs to be done. Let's say it says, okay, the engine has to be overhauled every 2,000 hours. The wheel bearings have to be packed at least once a year, that sort of thing. Moving on to airports, and maneuvering area is the part of an aircraft other than the aircraft that is intended to be used for takeoff and landing or movement of an aircraft. So that's a short way of saying runways and taxiways. That's your maneuvering area. An MF area, mandatory frequency area. This will come up quite a bit in your flight training, is the area around an aerodrome where there is a mandatory radio frequency. We'll get into this during your navigation and actually a bit later on in the air loss section, everything that is entailed in mandatory frequency areas. The owner is in respect to an aircraft or a remotely piloted aircraft system, so most people call that a drone. And that's the person who has legal custody and control of the aircraft. A special aviation event means an air show, an air race, aerobatic competition, fly-in, or balloon festival. And if you want to have any of these, you typically need a special flight operation certificate from Transport Canada. It's just a way of ensuring the safety of spectators. So if you ever have a bunch of people and they just want to come at the same time to your small grass strip for a fly-in, and there's going to be a bunch of people there, it's best you get an SFOC from the minister. Okay, moving on to administration and compliance. One of the things in the Aeronautics Act and the CARS, if a Transport Canada inspector requests that they inspect your aircraft or requests the production of documents and prohibition, that you must give these documents to the minister, and they have a right to search your aircraft if they want to. Now you might say, hey, wait a minute, don't they need a search warrant? No, they don't need a search warrant. Police need a search warrant, but Transport Canada inspectors don't. And the reason for that is that they have an administrative function. A police officer can send you to jail based on and arrest you based on what they find if they conduct a search. So they need a judicial search warrant first, whereas a Transport Canada inspector, all they can do is give you a fine or take your license away if they find something they don't like. So that's why there's a difference there, and that's why you don't need they don't need a search warrant to come and search your aircraft. If the minister asks for your Canadian aviation documents, your pilot's license, you have to return it to them. And you have to keep a record, so like logbooks, and you can keep this electronically, but you have to secure these records against any sort of loss. Okay, moving on to some sample questions. There's a question out of your pre-solo test. The maneuvering area of an airport, is that area A, normally referred to as the ramp or apron, B, which includes the apron, taxiways, and runways, C, used when taxiing to and from the parking area, and D, used for taxiing, takeoff, and landing. So if we recall earlier, it's that area where the aircraft can maneuver on, but it excludes the apron. So that would be, the correct answer would be D, used for taxi, takeoff, and landing. This next question I didn't go over in the lesson, but I will include it because it's another P-STAR lesson. Every person who's the holder of any pilot license or permit shall on demand produce such license or permit for inspection by persons authorized by the minister, by peace officer, so that's a police officer, and flight service station operators. So those are kind of like air traffic controllers. So that's probably a no. Transport Canada airport managers. This one should kind of catch your attention that airport managers aren't with Transport Canada. They're two different things. So I'd say you can probably cross that one off. C, immigration officers. So yeah, it's probably right. You cross a border, you land, they say, oh, you have your own airplane. I'd like to see your passport and I'd like to see your pilot's license. And then D, all of the above. Well, we already excluded the other ones. So correct answer is C. That concludes this incredibly boring lesson. I hope you're still with us as we move into our next lesson. Thanks for joining me.